The world gasped as King Charles signed a royal decree that shattered centuries of unspoken privilege. In a move no one predicted, he stripped Queen Camilla's family of their royal privileges, leaving the nation stunned and the public cheering. The announcement rippled through the palace like a thunderclap, leaving courtiers whispering in disbelief. For years, Camilla's relatives had quietly enjoyed access, invitations, and influence, standing in the glow of royal grandeur. And now, in a single stroke of a pen, it was all gone. Reporters scrambled for answers, cameras flashed outside Buckingham, and commentators rushed to interpret what could drive a monarch to such a decisive, even ruthless, act. The timing made it more shocking, still. Charles had been long accused of bending to compromise, yet here he stood, as an iron-willed king who appeared unshaken by sentiment. The first reactions were immediate. Some in the press declared it an act of bravery, others a brutal betrayal of his own wife. Across the country, however, the public response leaned heavily in Charles's favor. Crowds outside royal residences were not protesting, but applauding. For many, this was more than just a bureaucratic adjustment. It was a symbolic return to the purity of monarchy, free from what they saw as unnecessary attachments. Stripping Camilla's family of their privileges became synonymous with defending tradition. For countless Britons still haunted by Diana's tragic fate, it felt like Charles had finally chosen her memory over Camilla's ambitions, finally aligning himself with the sentiment that Diana's legacy should reign untarnished. The cheers that erupted weren't only for the act itself, but for what it represented. A king finally choosing the crown over compromise. Inside palace corridors, however, the mood was anything but celebratory. Whispers snaked through gilded hallways, servants exchanging glances, advisors muttering in hushed voices. Many asked the same question. Was this truly Charles's decision? Or had he been pushed to the brink? Some insisted it was William who had urged him to act, a son fiercely protective of his children's place in the monarchy. Others believed Princess Anne's sharp tongue and unyielding defense of tradition had cornered the king into making a choice he could no longer delay. But a few close confidants suspected something more. This was not reaction, but premeditation. A strike Charles had been planning for months, waiting for the perfect moment to unleash it. Every rumor only fueled the sense that this was less a simple decision and more the climax of a hidden struggle. For Camilla herself, the blow was personal. Her family's ties to royal life had been nurtured carefully, woven into public events and family occasions. To see those privileges erased was not only humiliating, but a warning. Her influence, once thought untouchable, could be dismantled. Observers wondered if this was a fracture in the marriage itself, a subtle message from Charles that the monarchy must remain greater than any individual's attachments. The symbolism was unmistakable. No matter how close one stood to the throne, only bloodline would rule. The very act of removing Camilla's family was Charles reclaiming authority from the shadows of favoritism, stepping firmly into a role where tradition, not sentiment, dictated his rule. And yet, even as the world debated whether Charles was a king strengthened by conviction or weakened by pressure, one thing was certain. This was not a decision born in a single moment. Its roots stretched deep into old feuds, whispered scandals, and tensions that had simmered for years. What appeared to the public as a bold act of justice was, in truth, the surface of a story far more complex. Hidden rivalries, betrayed trusts, and long-festering resentments had converged to produce this stunning moment. But behind this ruthless decision lies a story of betrayal, rivalry, and a hidden royal struggle that Camilla never saw coming. For decades, Camilla's family quietly wove themselves into the fabric of royal life, attending ceremonies, sitting in places once reserved for blood heirs. But how did they rise so high? And why did Charles now decide to bring it crashing down? The story begins with Camilla's children, Tom Parker Bowles and Laura Lopes, who initially lived outside the public gaze, comfortably distanced from the storm of monarchy. Yet as Camilla's influence over Charles deepened, their presence in royal circles began to grow. Invitations once reserved for dukes and princes extended to them. Appearances at events became more frequent, their faces steadily becoming part of the royal backdrop. To some, this was a harmless family, simply standing beside family. But to others, it was the start of something far more dangerous, outsiders edging their way into the sacred realm of monarchy. Soon, whispers of privilege began to shadow their rise. Tom was rumored to enjoy lucrative connections tied to his stepfather's crown. Laura's social circle expanded, fueled by access only royal proximity could provide. Invitations to galas, placements at ceremonies, positions of visibility were the kinds of privileges that came not from blood, but from association. To the public, these subtle gains carried the stench of favoritism. They were not earned by birthright or service, but by the quiet influence of a queen consort determined to see her family elevated. The monarchy, already fragile in the wake of Diana's legacy, began to look compromised in the eyes of those who believed that only blood heirs should ever share its stage. For years, resentment simmered. Tabloids drew stark contrasts between Camilla's children and Diana's sons, William and Harry. One pair carried the weight of bloodline, the other, the aura of privilege. Each public appearance only deepened the divide. In quiet conversations across Britain, people muttered that Camilla's children were enjoying honors that Diana's grandchildren should rightfully inherit. The monarchy's image, once rooted in purity of lineage, seemed under siege from those who carried no drop of Windsor blood. These doubts didn't stay confined to the public. They seeped into the palace itself. Princess Anne and Prince Edward, guardians of tradition, watched with cold disapproval. Their silence was telling, their glances sharper than words. To them, the creeping presence of Camilla's family was not an innocent coincidence, but a breach of order, a distortion of the crown's hierarchy. Anne, in particular, fiercely protective of her mother's legacy, viewed it as an insult to the discipline and duty that had defined Elizabeth's reign. If Camilla's relatives were permitted to ascend unchecked, what would become of the monarchy's carefully guarded sanctity? William's stance was quieter, but far more dangerous. He did not voice public outrage, nor did he storm against his stepmother's ambitions. Instead, he watched. His silence was icy, his demeanor restrained but resolute. To those who knew him well, the message was unmistakable. He would not allow his mother's memory to be erased, or his children's birthright diluted. In the corridors of power, that silence was interpreted as a warning, a storm waiting to break. And yet, critics both inside and outside the palace painted Camilla's family's ascent as nothing short of opportunistic. They were portrayed as beneficiaries of influence, climbing a ladder built not on blood, but on borrowed power. For every smile captured in photographs, there was a shadow of doubt. For every honor extended, there was a murmur of outrage. And with each passing year, those murmurs grew louder. But the higher they climbed, the deeper the cracks became, and soon, whispers of scandal began to echo through Buckingham's gilded halls. The truth was never far from the surface. From controversial deals to whispered betrayals, Camilla's family carried shadows that the monarchy could no longer ignore. For years, polite society tried to look the other way, glossing over stories that painted her relatives in a less than noble light. But the tabloids refused to stay silent. Headlines began to sting, and rumors hardened into allegations that were too loud to be dismissed. Tom Parker Bowles, once seen as harmlessly charming, found himself under scrutiny for questionable associations that tainted his polished image. Businessmen with reputations less than pristine appeared in his orbit, and when those ties surfaced in public, the whispers turned into open speculation. Was Camilla's son leveraging his stepfather's throne for gain? The danger grew when business dealings overlapped with royal occasions. Invitations to grand events, the kind that were meant to symbolize dignity and tradition, suddenly became tainted with suspicion. Deals inked in the shadows appeared linked to appearances in the spotlight. What should have been private ventures took on the foul odor of exploitation when tied to the crown. It was not lost on critics that these dealings emerged just as Camilla's family secured more access than ever before. To the press and to the people, the conclusion was clear. Royal privilege was being traded for profit. The accusations only intensified. Commentators began openly declaring that Camilla's children were cashing in on the royal name. A cookbook launch, a restaurant opening, an art exhibition, everything that carried their signatures now carried the weight of suspicion. Were these successes born of talent, or were they fueled by the crown's glow? Public opinion tilted against them, branding them not as proud kin, but as opportunists. Whispers of fraudulent royals spread, cutting deep into the monarchy's already fragile reputation. The public, still protective of Diana's legacy, saw the rise of Camilla's family as not just opportunism, but a betrayal of everything the late princess had endured. Inside the palace, patience was wearing thin. Princess Anne and Prince Edward, never ones to indulge sentiment, voiced their discontent behind closed doors. Their warnings were sharp, their words unrelenting. "This will destroy us," Anne is said to have declared, a chilling echo that struck Charles at his core. For her, and for Edward, the monarchy was not a stage for outsiders to play upon. Every scandal tied to Camilla's family was a blade cutting into the dignity their mother had built with iron discipline. Their frustration grew into fury, and their fury became pressure Charles could no longer ignore. But at the center of the storm was Camilla herself, desperately trying to shield her children from the onslaught. She pleaded for restraint, begged for understanding, and tried to smother the flames of scandal before they consumed everything. Her defenses, however, only fueled the perception that she was placing family above crown, heart above duty. Each move she made to protect them seemed to unravel further in the public's eye, casting her as a queen consort more concerned with personal loyalty than national legacy. As the press sharpened their knives and the palace braced for fallout, it seemed only a matter of time before something irreversible shattered the fragile balance. And just when the walls of scandal seemed to close in, it was William who tipped the balance, making a move that would seal their fate. The heir to the throne had remained silent for years. But silence does not mean consent. William's private conversations with Charles turned into a weapon that would change everything. For too long, he had watched from the sidelines as Camilla's family edged closer to the heart of royal life, their privileges increasing while the memory of his mother seemed to fade into the background. William's silence, once interpreted as tolerance, was in fact calculation. He understood the monarchy better than anyone. Its survival depended not on sentiment, but on perception. And the perception now was that the crown had been compromised, weighed down by a family with no rightful claim. When he finally approached his father, William did not thunder or rage. He spoke with measured precision, a quiet intensity that could not be ignored. He laid bare his fears that his children's inheritance, their future as the true heirs, was at risk of being overshadowed. The monarchy was already fragile, and if Camilla's relatives were allowed to retain influence, the crown itself would be dragged into disrepute. His appeal was not merely political but deeply emotional. In his words, one name hung heavily in the air: Diana. William invoked his mother's legacy not as nostalgia, but as a warning. Diana had suffered because of betrayal, and now her memory was being sullied again by those who sought to benefit from the throne without ever earning their place within it. For Charles, who lived under Diana's shadow even in death, the reminder was impossible to ignore. Beneath the polished formality of their conversations, tension between father and son began to boil. Their relationship, already fragile, strained under the weight of unspoken truths. Charles saw his son as pressing too hard. William saw his father as too willing to compromise. Every exchange left the air heavier, every silence more dangerous. Charles feared losing Camilla if he acted too harshly, but William feared losing the monarchy itself if nothing was done. It was a clash not of words, but of visions. An older king reluctant to tear down the walls he had built around his marriage, and a future king desperate to safeguard the crown for his children. Yet, William was not alone in his quiet rebellion. Behind the palace curtains, he found an unlikely ally in Princess Anne. The two, often separated by age and temperament, discovered common cause in their defense of tradition. Their meetings were discreet, their words sharp and uncompromising. Anne brought with her the weight of her mother's legacy. William carried the fire of his mother's memory. Together, they became a force Charles could no longer dismiss. Their combined pressure was subtle but relentless, a tightening noose around the indulgences once granted to Camilla's family. This was not a haphazard push. It was a carefully orchestrated plan. William knew timing was everything. Strike too soon, and his father might resist. Strike too late, and the monarchy might be beyond repair. He positioned every conversation, every concern, as part of a broader design to force Charles's hand. Slowly, his father began to realize that inaction was no longer an option. The weight of public opinion, the legacy of Elizabeth, the watchful eyes of Anne, all converged into one inescapable truth. Camilla's family had to be removed from royal privilege. And then came William's decisive words, spoken with chilling clarity. If they stay, the monarchy falls. It was not a plea, but a prophecy. His father, the king, understood the message. This was not just a son speaking to his father. It was the future confronting the present. For Charles, the crown itself was at stake. and William made it clear that the path forward demanded sacrifice. But if William's pressure lit the spark, it was Anne who fanned the flames into a raging fire that consumed Camilla's family. Anne, the iron pillar of tradition, had no patience for compromise. When Camilla's family pushed too far, Anne struck with precision, and Charles could no longer ignore his sister's fury. For years, she had stood quietly in the background, the embodiment of duty and discipline, rarely seeking the limelight yet commanding respect with every word unspoken. But as she watched Camilla's children take places at ceremonies once reserved for blood royals, her silence snapped. To Anne, it was an insult to her mother's memory and to the centuries of order Queen Elizabeth had preserved. Seeing Camilla's family standing shoulder to shoulder with the Windsors was not merely inappropriate, it was sacrilege. Her fury did not simmer in whispers, it boiled into sharp, unrelenting words. Anne confronted Charles directly, cutting through hesitation with a voice that left no room for defiance. "This ends now," she declared, not as a plea, but as a command. She reminded him of his responsibility to protect the monarchy from dilution, to safeguard the very institution their mother had dedicated her life to. The exchange was not between siblings, but between two forces of power, one holding the crown, the other wielding the authority of legacy. For Charles, the moment was crushing. His sister's eyes bore into him with the weight of Elizabeth's ghost, and he could feel his defenses cracking. The tension seeped into every gathering. At Windsor dinners, silence became the sharpest weapon. Camilla's family sat uncomfortably under Anne's cold stare, their every movement met with unspoken judgment. Conversations grew clipped, smiles forced, laughter absent. Even the most loyal courtiers could sense the air turning heavy, as if the walls themselves were aware of the battle unfolding inside. What should have been moments of unity among royals instead became theaters of hostility, with Anne making her disapproval known without uttering a word. What made her stance even more powerful was the way the public embraced it. Anne's refusal to bend to sentiment resonated with people who longed for tradition, for the iron discipline of the late Queen. She became the embodiment of the monarchy's integrity, a guardian unwilling to let outsiders breach the sacred circle of the crown. Tabloids, once skeptical of her stern demeanor, now celebrated her as the protector of Elizabeth's legacy. In her, the public saw a woman unshaken by modern compromises, unyielding in defense of the throne. But beneath Anne's cold resolve lay a deep emotional current. She was not merely fighting against Camilla's family, she was fighting for her mother's memory. Elizabeth had built the monarchy on sacrifice, duty, and devotion, never allowing personal preference to taint her reign. Anne, shaped in that mold, felt a personal obligation to uphold those standards. In her heart, Camilla's family represented everything Elizabeth had resisted: privilege without duty, access without legitimacy. For Anne, their presence was not just inconvenient, it was a betrayal of the crown her mother had guarded with unwavering strength. And so, Anne wielded Elizabeth's legacy as a weapon. Every time she invoked her mother's name, it was as though the late Queen herself stood behind her, lending weight to every word. Charles, torn between love for Camilla and loyalty to his sister, began to realize that ignoring Anne meant not only defying blood, but defying the legacy of the Queen herself. He could delay, he could hesitate, but the tide Anne was pushing against him was unstoppable. But Anne's rage was only half the story. The people's voice roared louder, and Charles realized his monarchy was at stake if he did nothing. When the decision finally came, the people did not weep for Camilla's family. They cheered. For them, this was not cruelty, but justice long overdue. For years, Britons had watched uneasily as those without royal blood enjoyed privileges once reserved for the sacred lineage of monarchs. Now, with a single decree, Charles had drawn a bold line between heritage and intrusion, and the nation felt he had finally chosen correctly. Crowds erupted in applause outside Buckingham Palace and Windsor, their cheers echoing not only for the king's authority, but for what the act represented: the restoration of balance, the honoring of Diana's memory, the reclaiming of dignity long thought lost. For the public, Charles's strike was not seen as an act of coldness, but of courage, proof that the monarchy could still correct its course. Tabloid headlines fed this fire with relentless force. Front pages hailed the king's decision as an act of bravery, proclaiming him finally free from the shadow of compromise. The very papers that once criticized Charles for weakness now declared him decisive. "A king who stands tall," blared one cover, while another celebrated him as the defender of Diana. In the eyes of the media, this was not just about Camilla's family, it was about redemption. Charles, who had carried the weight of past scandals for decades, was at last recast as a monarch strong enough to sever ties when the monarchy itself was at risk. The public sphere amplified this triumph even further. Online campaigns surged within hours, with hashtags praising Charles's courage and celebrating the exclusion of Camilla's family from royal privilege. Memes, messages, and posts turned the decision into a national victory, painting it as the long-awaited cleansing of the monarchy's image. What was once simmering frustration became collective relief, the kind that binds a people closer to their institution. The voices of dissent, those who claimed cruelty or unfairness, were drowned in the tidal wave of support for Charles's judgment. At the heart of the celebration lay a symbolic clash that had defined the monarchy's modern identity: bloodline versus step relatives. To the people, there was no contest. Blood heirs embodied duty, sacrifice, and legitimacy. Step relatives represented intrusion and opportunism. Charles's decree was seen as a decisive reaffirmation that only the true line of succession, the blood of Elizabeth and Diana, would endure. It was a statement that the crown could not be diluted, that the sacred order remained intact. In that moment, the monarchy seemed to draw strength not from compromise, but from purity, a move that resonated deeply with the nation's longing for tradition. With this shift came a renewed embrace of William, Catherine, and their children. Public opinion swung firmly back to the future king and queen, painting them as the rightful continuation of Diana's dream and Elizabeth's discipline. Their images, once tangled in modern controversy, were now reframed as the beacon of continuity. The nation placed its hope in them more fervently than ever, seeing Charles's decree as a bridge leading directly to William's reign. It was not just Charles who had won support that day. It was the next generation who inherited its glow. Yet beneath the applause and the jubilation, an undeniable truth remained. The monarchy's survival was still fragile. Its strength depended entirely on trust, and though Charles had won a victory, it came at a cost. He had drawn a line that could not be erased, a line that would forever mark his reign as one defined by sacrifice within his own household. The cheers outside may have rung with triumph, but the silence inside the palace carried a different weight. Yet while the public celebrated, behind palace gates the mood was far darker. Camilla herself was shattered beyond repair. For Camilla, this was more than politics. It was personal. Stripped of her power to protect her family, the queen consort found herself isolated, humiliated, and betrayed by the man she thought she had won everything with. Behind the closed doors of her chambers, tears mixed with fury as the reality of Charles's decree sank in. She had spent decades clawing her way from the margins of scandal to the center of the monarchy, enduring ridicule, public hatred, and whispers of illegitimacy, all to stand at the king's side. And yet, with a single decision, the husband who had once risked it all for her had turned his back, dismantling the very protections she had fought to secure. The sense of betrayal was overwhelming. For years, Camilla had convinced herself that Charles's loyalty was unshakable, that their bond had been forged in the fire of adversity and made indestructible by time. But now, with her family cast aside, she could not shake the gnawing feeling that she had been sacrificed to preserve his crown. Every memory of devotion suddenly soured into suspicion. Had Charles only ever seen her as a means to an end? Was her family's downfall the price of his redemption? The trust that had sustained their marriage fractured, leaving behind an ache she could neither forgive nor forget. Adding to her torment were the ghosts of Diana, ever present, now louder than ever before. In the wake of Charles's decision, the comparisons resurfaced with brutal clarity. Diana's legacy was being celebrated in every headline, every chant of support for William and Catherine, while Camilla was once again cast as the outsider, the interloper, the woman who could never measure up to the saintly image of her predecessor. It was as though Diana's shadow had risen from the grave to haunt her reign, stripping away the fragile stability she thought she had finally achieved. The whispers she had long endured that Charles would always belong to Diana now echoed mercilessly in her mind. Her children, Tom and Laura, did nothing to ease her pain. Their anger burned hot, not at the public, but at Charles himself. They had tolerated years of scrutiny for the sake of their mother's marriage, believing that her sacrifices would shield them from the storm. But now, exiled from privilege, they saw only betrayal. Tom's fury was sharp and vocal. Laura's quieter but no less bitter. Both placed the blame squarely on the king who had cast them aside, and both urged their mother to see Charles for what they believed he had become, a monarch willing to sell his soul, even at her expense. As their resentment grew, so too did the danger. Camilla's family began to hint at retaliation, threatening to reveal secrets the palace had long buried. They had seen enough, heard enough, to cause damage if they chose. And for a monarchy already strained, even the whisper of such threats was enough to spark dread. Camilla, torn between love for her children and fear of losing the only life she had built, stood on the edge of disaster. Every plea she made to calm their rage only revealed how powerless she had become. The crown that once felt like her ultimate victory now pressed down like a curse. Once a symbol of triumph, it now chained her to a throne that was suffocating her. The glory she had imagined came instead as humiliation, a reminder that, no matter how far she rose, she would always be vulnerable to the tides of royal politics. Her crown had not saved her family. It had destroyed them. And as she looked at Charles, she could no longer see her champion, only her betrayer. But if Camilla thought her fury could shake the palace, she underestimated the final blow waiting just beyond the horizon. One parchment, one seal, one signature. Charles's decree did more than remove privileges. It redefined the monarchy's future and rewrote the balance of power forever. The document was brief, but its weight was immense. Camilla's family would no longer enjoy royal privileges, access, or recognition. It was not temporary, nor symbolic. It was permanent. No future monarch could reverse it without breaking precedent. It was a decision that shut a door once opened, a decree that drew a line across history and announced that only blood heirs would stand within the circle of royalty. For centuries, whispers of favoritism and blurred lines had hovered over the throne, but with this act, Charles declared an end to compromise. The ceremony that accompanied it was steeped in tradition, but charged with tension. Guards stood motionless, seals pressed into wax, the silence of the chamber broken only by the sound of pen to paper. It was a moment designed to project authority, but it carried undertones of betrayal and loss. Those who witnessed it knew they were watching not just the enforcement of royal law, but the unraveling of a family. To the public, the grandeur of the spectacle would be remembered as a king asserting his dominance. Inside the palace, however, it would be remembered as a fracture, a wound inflicted by Charles's own hand. Symbolically, the decree was clear. The monarchy was closing ranks around blood heirs. It was a defensive act, but also a declaration of survival. For centuries, the monarchy had been accused of drifting too far from its sacred traditions, of becoming diluted by compromise. Now, Charles was reclaiming it for those born into it by right, ensuring that William, Catherine, and their children would be protected from shadows that could diminish their inheritance. It was a signal to the people, and to history itself, that the crown would remain pure, untouchable, and uncorrupted by outsiders. And yet, for Charles, the moment was anything but triumphant. His hand trembled not from weakness, but from conflict. The man who had once defied the world to marry Camilla was now the same man stripping her family of the privileges she had fought so hard to secure. He carried the weight of his choice like a burden he could not share. To the world, he appeared resolute, but within, he wrestled with the knowledge that he had betrayed the woman who had stood by him through scandal, mockery, and decades of resistance. The crown demanded sacrifice, and for Charles, that sacrifice was love itself. What made the decree even more powerful was its public aftermath. In the days that followed, Charles issued a rare statement affirming his loyalty to William and his children, placing the monarchy's future squarely in their hands. The message was unmistakable. The House of Windsor belonged to the bloodline of Diana, and the throne would not be compromised again. It was an act that tied the monarchy's survival to William's family, binding them to the institution in a way that made the public believe once more in its destiny. But behind the polished announcement, fractures deepened, because while the monarchy was reborn in tradition, it was also left fractured within. Camilla's fury lingered in silence, her children seethed in humiliation, and Charles himself stood as a man split between king and husband, bound by a duty that cost him dearly. To the world, the crown gleamed brighter. Inside the palace, it had never felt heavier. And as the ink dried, one chilling question remained. Was this Charles's final act of strength, or the beginning of his downfall? The cheers may have filled the streets, but inside Buckingham Palace, the silence was deafening. Charles had acted, but at what cost? For the first time in years, public faith in his rule seemed restored. He was hailed as decisive, a monarch willing to put the crown above sentiment. Yet beneath that surface of approval, cracks in the crown remained visible. His decision, though celebrated by the people, had opened wounds within his own household that could never truly heal. Camilla's resentment simmered in the shadows, her quiet fury whispering of revenge. She had been humiliated, stripped of the one power she held dearest, the ability to protect her family. And while Charles gained applause from the masses, he lost trust in his marriage. Leaving the throne, surrounded by love, turned bitter. Against that fracture, William and Catherine emerged strengthened. Their position as the true future of the monarchy solidified. To the nation, they now represented not just continuity, but a vision of a royal family, uncorrupted by favoritism or compromise. Anne, too, was lifted high in the public eye. Her unrelenting defense of tradition was hailed as a silent enforcement of Elizabeth's legacy, the steel spine of the crown that reminded the world why the monarchy had survived for centuries. But even as she was celebrated, whispers of retaliation began to spread. Royal insiders feared Camilla's family might not remain silent, that secrets long buried could be unearthed in vengeance, tearing at the fragile fabric of the institution. The monarchy had survived this storm, but the cost was not yet measured. The crown gleamed brighter, but its foundations were unsettled. And as those closest to power looked toward tomorrow, a single fear echoed through the corridors of Buckingham. The monarchy survived today, but tomorrow may be its greatest trial. Because in the end, Charles's boldest act may not be remembered as the saving of the monarchy, but as the spark that set the final fire. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in the next one.